Welcome back to my Master License Guide. We're finally tackling the Super Master License. Unlike all of the other licenses so far, every single one of these is an entire lap. For the first test, we've got a Civic Type R at the world famous Mount Panorama. Mount Panorama can be a very tough, very complicated track, but I'm going to try to break it down for you so you can nail that gold. Keep in mind as you're going through that this is a front-wheel drive car, so going up and down this mountain can really exacerbate the understeer that you're going to feel. It is a really good front-wheel drive car though, so there's going to be less understeer than you might expect. Using the meter boards on the right, we're going to look for the 100 meter board, and right after you get all the way past it is when you're going to hit the brakes. Downshift to third, and just when you get past the 50 meter board is when we're going to start turning in. You want to get up on the curb or right next to it at the very least, on that throttle gently, and then track all the way out using all of that exit curbing. Be careful not to go on the grass because that'll kill all of your momentum, and there's this nice little concrete runoff, but make sure you steer back onto the pavement before you get to the grass. Now obviously I completely missed the apex there, but you can see how much speed you can carry through that corner even if you do miss it, so there's a lot of time to be found there. Don't be afraid to rev the car past the beep. The beep's really just to alert people who aren't paying a lot of attention to when to shift, but you can rev it out past that. Once again, we're using the 100 meter board as a braking reference, but this time you're going to brake right when you get to it instead of waiting until you get past it. We're also going to use the 50 meter board to time when we should turn in, and as you can see again, I've missed the apex, but we're able to carry a lot of speed through. If you look at my throttle inputs, as I get on the throttle, I'm adding a little bit of steering first, and then I hesitate just a little bit before getting back on the throttle. You really want to just get on the throttle in one solid motion, but if you do feel that you're going to go into the wall, don't be afraid to lift off the throttle just briefly to make sure that you don't hit that wall. It's much better to go slightly slower than to ruin your whole lap. Look for the gap in the wall on the right, and at that point, we're going to turn in, lift afterwards, and wait till we're almost pointed at the armor wall sign in the distance to then get on the brakes. You do not want to brake fully. We're going to use a little bit more than 50% brake pressure as we enter the corner. Downshifting to third and staying there, we're going to wait until we get to this crack in the road, and at that point, we're going to turn in, trail brake for the last bit, come off the brakes entirely, add more steering, and then get back on the throttle. Getting off the brakes as early as possible is really important for navigating that last corner. Aiming for about the middle of the road, there's another gap in the wall to the left, and that is about when we're going to start turning in. You can stay nearly full throttle, but you'll have to lift just barely as you turn in, or you're going to get a little bit of understeer, which will make you go into that wall. Looking for the lone tree on the left, when we get all the way past that, we're going to turn in, lift off barely, and then upshift, using the upshift to tuck the nose in a little bit. You're probably going to have to come off the throttle just a little bit to make sure that you're not going to go wide and hit that wall, but you do want to be extremely brave. Stay on the throttle as much as you possibly can here. From here, you're going to want to fight your instincts to track out immediately. You actually want to stay towards the middle of the track for most of this. If you see where the wall turns black, we're going to start turning in a little bit before that, and we're going to aim for the middle of the track as we go over this crest. As you go down this little hill, you'll want to come off the throttle just a little bit, and at the very lowest part of this section, right about here, is when we're going to start turning in a little bit more with the lowest amount of throttle, and then get back on the throttle as we go over this curb, making sure you don't go past that curb. You've got to be brave, but again, lift off the throttle if you need to avoid hitting that wall. Lining up as close to this wall as you can, as soon as your right tire gets onto that curb, we're going to lift off the throttle and start turning in. Now, I was a little bit too brave. You should brake just a little bit, but if I turned in a little bit more aggressively, I wouldn't have gone in the grass. If you do go in the grass, stay on the throttle. As a front-wheel drive car, it's going to be more stable than a rear-wheel drive car. Now, when we're setting up for this corner, you can see where the grass ends on the right. We're going to use that as a turn-in point, and we're also going to lift off the throttle at the same time. We want to get as close to that right wall as we possibly can. Right before we get under this sign is when we want to add some brakes. Now, if you brake too hard, you're going to make the car spin, but not hard enough, you're not going to slow down nearly enough, so it's a delicate balance. Once you get really close to the wall, you're going to be able to see this blue wall in the distance, as well as the scaffolding with the people standing on it. At this point, you can brake much harder, but still not 100%. Downshift to third, trail brake, and use as much of this curb as you can, and once you finally get off the curb, aimed just to the left of the next wall, we're going to finally use 100% brake. Trail brake once you get close to that wall so you can hug it tightly, and you're going to see that I carried way too much speed and rotated the car too much. A little bit of rotation is okay. What I did was just a little bit too crazy. Now either way, you're probably going to want to add a little bit of throttle here. You've got to make sure you keep up your speed. If you do find yourself rotating like I do, oversteering, then throttle is exactly what's going to help you in a front-wheel drive car. When you get to the end of the curbing on the right here, we're going to need to switch directions anyway. Since I had a lot of rotation, I was able to throw it back the other way. The same thing's going to work even if you didn't have a big sliding moment like I did. Come off the throttle, turn in, tap the brakes, and then get back on the throttle as your car rotates over the next corner. Being careful not to steer into this wall. Be careful not to give it full throttle until you're past this corner and you know that you're not going to understeer directly into this wall on the left. Move slightly away from this wall so you can hug it and then line up on the left side afterwards, but then look for the white part of the wall on the right. That's when we're going to turn in and add a little bit of brake. I want you to pay attention to my throttle as well. I'm using just a little bit of throttle to maintain the balance of the car, which is something that is pretty common in the front wheel drive cars with this game. If you look right here, there's a pretty sharp bend in the track, as well as the wall, of course, and then it also crests downward. That's when we're going to hit the brakes, downshift all the way to second gear, and then we're going to start turning in. You can aim for the Falcon sign in the distance, and right when you see the blue of the Falcon sign on the left part of the wall, that's when we're going to start turning in. As you trail brake in and stay close to this wall, we're going to look for the part of the wall that gets a little bit higher, a little taller right there, and that is when we're going to shift back up to third gear and then gently get back on the throttle. At this speed, the car shouldn't understeer too much, even if you're still steering out of the corner when you apply the throttle. For this little part of the straight, you do want to just turn in really early here. You don't have to worry too much about setting up for that corner. You just want to stay on the left here. As you can tell, the whole lap has been pretty scruffy, but when you see the finishing time that I was able to nail with this pretty bad lap, then you're going to see how easy it should be to get the gold here. Using all of this concrete runoff on the left, we want to turn in right at this electrical pole and then use a little bit of the curb here so we can align ourselves to the right. Make sure you straighten your car out and settle it and then brake at the 200 meter board. If you're still steering, it can be disastrous when you hit the brakes. Brake in a straight line, hugging the right like always, and be very brave. Wait till you get to the 50 meter board before you start turning in. We're going to stay in third gear for that exit here as well. You can expect some understeer here, so don't be afraid to come off the throttle rather than just driving yourself off track. You'll need to lift again to navigate this right-hand turn, and it is a little bit tighter than you might think, so just be very careful not to drive off the track here either. And now only one corner stands between you and a gold medal in this license test. Looking for the 100 meter board, we actually want to brake before we get there. Get down to third gear, and the light post directly after the 50 meter board is when we're going to start turning in. Hit your apex and be very gentle on the throttle. Again, I can't stop saying this enough. It's much more important to just lift off the throttle a little bit than it is to stay on the throttle and go directly off track. It's really difficult to predict when a front wheel drive car is going to understeer sometimes. From there, make sure you don't forget to shift up to fourth, and you've got your lap. And as you can see, I beat it by 3 seconds despite how bad that lap was. Let's go over it in full speed. So as you can tell, and as I pointed out, I missed a lot of apexes. I actually completely missed the first and the second apex, and the lap overall just wasn't that great. But the fact that I beat the challenge by 3 full seconds means that there is a lot of wiggle room if you're going for that gold trophy. I was initially annoyed by the shifting noise, the shifting siren or whatever you want to call it, but it is pretty useful because you don't have to look down at your revs at all. When I turned in here, I turned in a little bit after the 50, and that's definitely why I ended up understeering here. I think I could have braked at the same point and then turned in a little bit early and I would have been fine, but of course I was able to get on the throttle early enough that I kept up more momentum than my Ghost. This left-hander right here is one of the trickiest parts of the track, and I find that a lot of people are just braking way too much. Make sure you don't brake a lot and come off the brakes as early as you can to free up some steering going up the hill. The margins here are really tough, and if you can figure out the timing to make it so you don't have to lift off the throttle at all after you've gotten on the throttle, then you're going to find a lot of speed. Going down that little crest, it's really important not to track out before the crest because it will suck you into that wall. And of course, you don't want to miss your apex here and go into the grass. But if you do, because it's a front wheel drive car, you can stay fully on that throttle. The reason that I spun out here is I carried a little bit too much speed instead of slowing down a little bit more, but you actually do want the car to rotate. If you can get the car to rotate like that, but of course not as dramatically, then you're going to be able to carry a lot of speed through there. It might seem counterintuitive if you're not used to it, but go ahead and watch that part again where I'm on the throttle just a little bit as we go down that hill. You're actually going to be braking more effectively because your car is not going to be unbalanced. If you use a little bit of throttle and you keep more weight evenly over all 4 tires, then it's actually going to slow down even better. And of course, if you slide out whatsoever, it's going to really increase the distance for your braking. So using a little bit of throttle just to keep the car balanced going downhill is a really good trick to use. You can use this curb on the left hand, but if you go too high on it, it can make you bounce all the way into that grass, so be really careful if you do use it. For the final corner, I want you to actually see that I oversteered a little bit and I had to correct it, but I was still able to hit the apex here. If you do end up oversteering a little bit into a corner in a front-wheel drive car, you can usually just fix it with a little bit of throttle. So yeah, 3 seconds clear of gold, and it was a really terrible lap, so I definitely believe that you're going to be able to get gold on this one. The second of the super licenses is actually in my all-time favorite Porsche. Not only that, it's a rallycross event, and one of the reasons I really like this Porsche is because it really likes to get sideways. Contrary to popular belief, however, rally speed isn't about being sideways all the time, it's about being sideways at the right time. As you start off, you just want to floor it, you don't have to worry about grip at all. Aim yourself slightly to the right, and you're going to look for this little sign right here. Right when you get to this little F sign, you're going to turn in, lift off, and then add just a little bit of brake. So you want to make sure that you're getting just your right tires all the way up on the white and red part of the curb. This deep red part that you see in the infield, when it turns white, you want to be coming off of the curbing right about then. You can see that there's some tire marks, approximately the line that I took. You don't want to get on the throttle too much because you'll push yourself too wide, but you do want to get on the throttle fully and still steer yourself all the way to the inside to set up for the first turn. About a car length before the end of the curb on the left, we're going to change direction, still staying full throttle, aiming for the dirt part of the track. Right before you get to the end of the pavement, you're going to hit the brakes and downshift to first gear. In order to get the car to rotate, what you want to do is brake hard in a straight line, turn the wheel, and then start lifting off the brakes a little bit faster than you normally would for normal trail braking. As soon as the car starts rotating, you're going to want to countersteer and get on the throttle to continue that rotation while still accelerating. As you gain speed around the corner, the car is going to stop sliding and start straightening out. When it starts straightening out, you want to lift off the throttle again to make sure that it can continue rotating while you're still accelerating. As you lift off, turn in, and you should get the car to rotate again. Get back on the throttle, and we're going to want to shift up to second gear really early here, making sure that you don't hit the rev limiter. Watch my steering very carefully here. What you're going to see is that I turn pretty sharply towards the wall a long time before I get to the actual corner itself. It takes time for cars in dirt to react, so what you've got to do is anticipate every corner and turn in early. Once again, before we hit this crest, you're going to see that I changed the rotation of the car because we need the car to rotate while mid-air, and we're definitely going to catch a little bit of air right here. While mid-air, you're going to notice that I'm not turning the steering wheel too much, just a little bit, and I'm also applying brakes. We want the car to rotate as we hit the ground, but we don't want it to rotate too quickly. As soon as you feel the rotation, get back on the throttle. We want to stay far to the right side of the track and get really close to this cement barrier on the right. Before I get to that barrier, however, I'm going to brake and then come off the brakes, braking again to get the car just to slow down and neutralize the rotation. We don't want to rotate when we're back on the cement. Once you get to the pavement, you want to completely neutralize all of your rotation. You just want to take this corner like normal, putting your right tires on the curb. We're going to take this really tight and really slow. Get back on the throttle once you get past that corner, and if you rotate just a little bit, that's okay, but any kind of sliding on the cement is going to make you lose a lot of time in Gran Turismo. From here, keep driving normal, stay close to the curb on the left, and then straighten yourself out. Staying full throttle until we get to this Gran Turismo sign on the right. Once we get past it, you're going to angle yourself in just slightly and get on the brakes about 85 to 90% pressure. We're going to try trail braking into this corner, but as you're going to see, I'm going to add a little bit of throttle, then more brake, then more throttle. If you find the car rotating too much, you want to add a little throttle. If it seems like you're going too fast, of course, add a little bit more brake, but if you do too much of either, it's going to make the car slide in ways that you do not want. So you've got to just kind of try to use the brake and the throttle to guide the car where you want it to go. You're going to see me staying on the throttle mostly until we get to the point where these little tire marks are shooting off to the side. Right then you're going to notice that I lift off the throttle while still steering to the left, then switch directions really quick with the steering, and then add a lot of brake. That's going to get the car to slow down and rotate past that barrier. But when we get past the barrier, you're going to notice that I come off the brakes, change direction with the steering wheel again, and then add more brake again to get the car to rotate the other way. As soon as it starts rotating, you're going to get back on the throttle and then just try to accelerate almost in a straight line so we get really close to the grass on the right. As we pass that little kink, we're going to come off the throttle and then get back on it a couple more times, trying to blip the throttle to get the car to rotate a lot towards the right. Keep an eye on where this final Gran Turismo sign is on the left. We're going to be facing the other direction, but when we get approximately to that position is when we need to change directions, downshift, hit the brakes, and try to get ourselves to rotate around this corner. Once again, the brake is going to get it to rotate, but you've got to use the throttle and the brakes in conjunction to make sure that you're staying really close to the inside, but also not drifting really far wide on the exit. If you're unfamiliar with how to make your car slide, then hopefully studying this is going to help you figure out all the different ways you can make it happen, because really this is just a class in rotating your car. The main thing you really want to focus on is not sliding at all on the pavement and sliding a lot when you're on the dirt. You can actually see my ghost in this run, actually 2 different ghosts, and you'll notice that both of them slide out a lot on the cement, and that's where most of my time is lost when I recorded those 2 ghosts. One of the things that's really difficult about figuring out how to slide a car is that sometimes the same input can do completely different things. So sometimes when you get on the throttle, as long as you don't get on the throttle too hard, you can shift weight to the back so it stops it from rotating. But if you get on the throttle really quickly, it can actually make it rotate even more by sliding out the rear tires. The brakes can do similar things. You can brake and get the car to rotate, or you can brake and get the car to go just completely neutral. What's really important is to understand how the shifting of the weight affects what happens, and then of course what the brake and throttle do to affect or exacerbate what's happening with the weight shifting. Weight transfer is really the name of the game, so I think if you have any trouble with the dirt, then doing this challenge and really getting used to all of this is probably going to help you overall. I think this is probably too short to really give a masterclass on drifting and sliding, so feel free to ask me any kind of questions in the comments. For the next test, we actually go back to the exact same track, but in the traditional GP layout. The car is a beautiful 1965 Honda F1 car, and that was the era before they had aerodynamics. I did a few more laps with this than I did with the other ones, and I kind of surprised myself with my pace, but we'll get into that after the lap. Since filming this, I've learned that braking on the curbs can actually make things pretty strange, so I'm probably going to go back and try to see what I can do without braking on the curbs. I should be able to beat the time. But for now, we're going to use the curbs. I wish I could be more exact, but approximately halfway between the 200-meter board and this black sign in the distance is where we're going to brake. Maximizing as much of the track as possible, I put just the right tires barely on the curb. Sorry for the ghosts, but if you see this little concrete strip in between the green, that is when we're going to start lifting off the brakes and turning in. Your goal should be to get just the left tires on this first curb and then squeeze as much throttle as you possibly can between here and the next corner. What we're going to do is try to do the same thing on this left-hander, lift off the throttle just slightly so we can make sure that we hit the proper line and then get back on the throttle fully while steering to the left. Right about the end of the green AstroTurf on the right is when we're going to change direction, staying on the throttle initially. Lift off the throttle only after the weight is shifted, and don't be afraid to coast as you let the car slowly creep in towards the apex. Once this orange part of the wall appears in the distance and before you're facing it, upshift to 4th gear and then gently get back on the throttle. Gently squeeze on the throttle, of course, and watch how I steer. You're going to notice that I'm not going full steering at all. We're going to make sure we're not going to get any understeer. However, I'm trying to make sure I don't get past the slip angle of the front tires by kind of testing out how much grip I have. You want to steer as little as you possibly can, tracking all the way out onto the curb. On the left, you can see the 100-meter board right here, as well as the 50-meter board underneath the bridge, and you're going to brake at approximately 80 meters. Braking in a straight line until you get to that bridge, you're going to see that the curbing kind of angles in towards where you want to go, and you're going to use that as a bit of a guide. Trail braking in 3rd gear, as you approach the apex, if you dip to 2nd and then back up to 3rd really quickly, you can get the car to rotate. As you can see, I did it a little bit too early, so I had to add a little bit of maintenance throttle before coming back off the curb and then getting on full throttle after that. Once again, be careful not to steer too much because you can get the front tires to just completely lose grip. Make your way to the right side of the track, and beyond the fence, it looks like what might be a concrete structure. Right before you get to that, that's when you want to hit the brakes. Following the tire marks is actually a good way to know when to turn in for this next corner, and you can see that I braked really deeply and I turned in a little bit quickly, which made the car rotate. When I came off the brakes, I came off them pretty quickly to let the car rotate even faster, and then I got back on the throttle, hitting a very late apex on that corner. Make sure you use all of the runoff here, going all the way out, putting only the left tires on the red and white part of the curb, and that should make sure that you're getting on the throttle early enough. Angle yourself so you're going straight to the curb of the next corner. However, this little curb right here, once you get past that, that is when you want to start braking. I actually braked a little bit too late, so I had too much speed going into this corner, which made me get on the throttle a little bit early to neutralize the slide. You do want a tiny bit of rotation, but only enough that you don't actually have to fix it with throttle. You want it to rotate just perfectly so you can get back on the throttle like normal and then take a straight line through there instead of drifting like that. Looking for the end of the curbing here on the left, as you brake initially and turn in, it's not going to want to turn very much. So what you've got to do is just trail brake like normal, but then dip to third gear and come off the brakes a little bit more to free up the front tires to turn in. Once the car rotates, you want to get back on the throttle, staying in third gear, and just try to hit the apex right after that bump on the inside of the curb. Again, you've got to be on the throttle early enough that you have to use all of this nice runoff past the curbing. We're carrying a lot of speed to the next braking zone, so we're going to have to brake really early. Looking up at the meter boards, we're going to actually brake right when we get past the 150 meter board. You're going to want to brake in a straight line all the way down to second gear and start turning in only when you get to the 50 meter board at the end. After that, you can then start lifting off the brakes, downshift to first to get it to rotate, and then back up to second gear for the exit. I actually like to avoid the inside curbing, and you've got to be really gentle on the throttle. If you slide out here, it's really easy to lose all of your momentum, and you definitely don't want to do that when you're in a car like this, on a track like this, going this slow. Looking carefully, you can see tire marks coming off the curb. That's what you want to follow. You do want to shift up to third gear despite the fact that you're going to be lifting off just a little bit to maximize the usage of that curb. Aiming for this big chunk of tire marks right here. Right before you get to that, you're going to brake, downshift to second, and you're not going to be on full brake. We're just going to make sure that we don't understeer at all going into this, and we want to tighten up the corner as much as we can immediately. I'm treating this kind of like a double apex, but I'm really not going that far away from the inside at all. You'll see that I'm coasting a lot, adding a little bit of throttle, and then back on the brakes before getting fully on the throttle as we pass that nice bump on the inside of the curbing. There's not a really good place to look for your turn-in point, but you can see these nice, convenient tire marks. This really deep, dark one, that is what we want to follow. What you want to do is stay full throttle, turn in, then lift, and then dab the brakes just a little bit so you can get the nose of your car as close to those cones as you possibly can. If you feel the car rotating too much, you can add a little bit of throttle, but we want to upshift to fourth gear before we fully get on the throttle for the exit. From here, we want to track out wide, and we're going to aim to straddle that yellow curbing in the distance. Once you feel that the entirety of your car is over the beginning of that yellow curb, that is when we're going to start braking. Turn in early enough so that your left tires both go over the yellow curb, and then downshift to third before getting back on the throttle. You can see I actually turned in a little bit too late, which definitely cost me a little bit of time, but as long as you get on the throttle cleanly, you don't slide, you should be totally fine. It's going to be pretty hard to go too far on the exit. Make sure you steer off the curb before you get to the grass, and there's your lap. So I wasn't quite sure what kind of time I got, but I was pretty sure it was pretty good. So I immediately went back out, I skipped past the replay, and I wanted to check out what my top 10 friends list looked like. After seeing myself in the top, I had to check out the top 10 of all time, and yeah, I was in 6th place. I actually maintained 6th place for a while. I think I'm in 8th place right now, a couple months after recording this. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, I've actually learned since recording this that you should not brake on the curves, and I think that's because it makes the ABS freak out a little bit. But either way, I was able to do it and still nail a good time, but I think that just means that if I don't brake on the curves, then maybe I can get an even better time. What it should do is increase the braking distance if you do brake on the curbs, so I should be able to brake even later if I don't use the curbs. Anyways, I digress. This car likes to oversteer when you downshift, and it can understeer a lot on throttle. As long as you're gentle, you probably shouldn't get a lot of throttle oversteer unless you really chuck it into a corner. But either way, this car does not have any kind of aerodynamics, so it's all mechanical grip. So what you learned in the last test about what happens when weight is transferring and the effect of braking and throttling while that's happening is probably actually going to play a big part in how you control this car. While in the last test, we learned how you can make the car slide with the brake, the throttle, and of course with the way that the weight is transferring. In this test, the only time you want it to slide at all is just rotating it into corners, and you don't want it to slide that much. So using that knowledge instead to push it to the limit of what the car can do rather than beyond the limit is the key here. With this hairpin coming up, I bet I could actually get a faster time by getting the car to rotate just a little bit on corner entry, but if that continues beyond the entry, if I slide out at all while I'm accelerating, I'm going to lose time, so I thought it was safer not to try that. You may notice when you go back and watch this that I'm not fully on the brakes a lot because these front tires are really skinny and they will slide out, they will understeer if you try to put too much pressure on them. This yellow curb is definitely a pain in the butt, but it's kind of the key to figuring out when to brake and to turn in. I should have turned in earlier. You can use the end of it as a guide. And I forgot to mention, when you upshift to fourth, you can actually get the car to slide out. So be very careful with your steering as you upshift for the final fourth gear. Test 4 is the legendary Jag XJ220 at Grand Valley, the beautiful new Grand Valley that features parts of the real California Highway 1. The ultimate key with this car is patience. It might be a supercar, but it is a 32-year-old supercar. Starting out all the way on the right, we want to start turning in before the end of the concrete barrier on the right, and instead of using the 500-meter board, we're actually going to look for this dude in the red shirt. We have to brake way early because this thing has wooden brakes. Hugging the outside until we can actually see the corner disappear beyond the barrier, we're going to brake in a straight line to the first of 2 apexes, turning in when we get to the 100-meter board. When we hit the first apex, you're going to go down to first gear, come off the brakes entirely after turning in up to second gear, and be very patient about applying the throttle. This car will take a long time to listen to your commands. It's more like requests, and you definitely have to be nice as you're making your requests of this car. Move to the right side of the track and turn at the beginning of the white billboards. Put your left tires in the gutter, but definitely avoid the dirt. That will give you a penalty in multiple places here. And right before this little walking bridge, that is where we're going to lift off, change directions, and then add a little bit of brakes. We want to guide the car so the right tires go in the gutter here, and then get back on the throttle, making sure that we do not touch the dirt on the left side at all. That will automatically end your lap. Once you do get on the throttle, you'll note that you still have to continue turning right to avoid going into the dirt here. There's a bit of deformation on the dirt on the inside where it looks like they're trying to make it look like people drove over it, but you definitely can't actually drive in the dirt there. Once your car is fully past this 400-meter board, I'm realizing that these are actually footboards. When it's past the 400-foot board, you want to hit the brakes and hit them hard. Continue guiding yourself to the left side of the track, aiming for the 100-meter board, staying full brake, downshifting to second gear, and when you get to the 100, that is when you're going to start turning in and downshift to first gear. Keeping heavy pressure as you trail brake in, you want to come entirely off the brakes and up to second gear early, right before the apex, then get back on the throttle. Again, very gently and be patient. You do not want to go off in the dirt here either. Once your car is fully stable, make your way to the right side of the track. At the 100-foot board, you're going to turn in, then lift, downshift, then add a little bit of brakes. What's going to happen is you're going to go over this yellow line and then back over it again, moving to the right lane. Once you cross over that yellow line again into the right lane, you want to downshift to first gear, maintaining brake pressure just so you don't go all the way off the track. When you get to these white synthetic hay bales or whatever they are, you're going to go back up to second gear, back on the throttle, and of course use the gutter if you can, avoiding the dirt. Lift to change directions, then get back on the throttle as you go around that corner, and then try to get all the way up close to this wall. Unfortunately, there are no distinct markings on the ground or the wall, but what I've found is once you get past this dotted white line, that is when you should brake. You should also turn in early enough that you're past that white line again before you get to the yellow diamond sign in the distance. Once again, you're going to need to come as close to the dirt without touching it as possible, and you do want to squeeze as much throttle in as you possibly can after you go around that corner. Carry speed through here instead of trying to set up way to the right. What you really want to do is go as fast as you possibly can until the braking zone. As soon as you're under that Grand Valley sign, that is when you want to brake hard in a straight line, downshift to first gear, and then turn in immediately. As long as you hug this really tight left-hander, you should be able to get on that throttle early, whether or not you are close to the left or close to the right side of the track before entering this corner. Once again, you do want to be in second gear as you exit, but this car does have enough power at this low speed that you can slide out, and if you go in the dirt here, it will ruin your lap. Stay close to the right side of the track, looking at the number boards on the right, and once you get all the way past the 200-foot board, that is when you're going to hit the brakes. Once you get past the 100-foot board, that's when you want to start trail braking and turning in, and when you pass the yellow line, that's when you want to go down to first gear to get the car to really rotate into the corner. Once I hit the apex, I'm going to shift up to second gear and coast for just a moment to make sure the car can continue rotating as I get on the throttle, and then we're going to actually dive directly to the next corner. There's a dark part of the barrier to the right here, and right when you get there, you're going to hit the brakes, immediately start trail braking, and you're going to turn this into a double apex corner. As soon as you come off the first apex, downshift to first gear, come all the way off the brakes and coast for a second, up to second gear, and you're going to try to hit that second apex right at the beginning of the bridge. As you can see, I missed it just a little bit. I encourage you to track out all the way to this elevated part of the curbing, but you definitely have to go back onto the track itself before you get to that barrier. Keep in mind that we're dealing with 90s brake technology as you approach this next corner. Looking at the number boards, we're actually going to brake right when we get past the 300-foot board. Brake in a completely straight line until you get to this first column. That is when you're going to turn in, downshift to first gear, and conveniently, the apex is right where this shadow is. Use the throttle and brake as needed to stay on the line and stay really close to the inside, making sure you don't go off the line, and definitely keep up your speed as you hug the inside right here. Get fully on the throttle when you know that you can stay in the right lane. If you see where the pavement kind of changes, as soon as you get past that line, that is when we want to hit the brakes, turn in, and try to hit a late apex on this curb, avoiding going on the curb or touching any of these cones because that will immediately end your lap. Keep up your speed by modulating the throttle, but don't go too fast. We want to aim right about here, and when we get to that yellow line, that's when we're going to change directions, lift off a little bit to get really close without touching those cones, and back on the throttle. I went slightly too far into the dirt, and it almost gave me a penalty, but luckily it did not, because that would have completely ended my lap. And as you can see from the ghost, we did not have the best exit. From the middle of the track, we want to turn in, hug the left side, and right when you get into the tunnel, we're going to turn, lift, and then dab the brakes just a little bit so you can go all the way up on the inside curbing, putting 2 tires all the way up as much as you can. I actually lost time there because I didn't quite hit the apex. If you can hit the apex there, you'll be able to get on the throttle a lot earlier and carry a lot more speed through there. All right, let's go through it full speed. Like I keep saying, this car feels like it has absolutely wooden brakes. It's just because it's a pretty old car by today's standards. It's made in 1992, I believe, so you've got to give yourself a lot of time to brake. It's going to feel like the car isn't turning too. You've just got to make sure that you keep scrubbing off speed as you enter the corners. You'll notice that I also completely missed the exit, and that just means that there's a lot of time to be found here. And the time that I set is nearly 3 seconds faster than the required time. Actually, it's nearly 4 seconds faster than the required time. So you know that you can mess this up a lot and still get gold. I keep saying this, but avoid the dirt at all costs because it can give you a penalty and or just end your lap right there. You'll notice on a lot of the corners I have to come completely off the brakes in order to free up enough grip in the front to get the car to turn. So make sure that you decelerate really early for all these corners, and don't be afraid to come completely off the brakes and just coast through a lot of these corners. The car mostly feels like a boat, but it's in the really slow corners that you can see that it does have enough power to slide out. You'll see that as I negotiated this corner, I did slide out just a little bit, but I was able to correct it quick enough that I didn't lose a lot of speed. This first left-hander of this big S-curve is pretty straightforward, but the second one, you really don't have to set up super wide for it just because of the shape of it, I think. You can actually just enter really close to the inside, stay on the inside, and you'll still be able to get on the throttle really early. Despite knowing how early I had to brake, I still overshot the braking mark for this corner many times in filming this, so whenever you think you should brake, you should probably brake even earlier than that. I mentioned the shadow being a really good point of reference, and usually I wouldn't do that because this game does have dynamic lighting. However, in this test, it's always going to be static conditions, or at least for the very first lap. If you sat here for like an hour, the time might change, but since every single lap starts the exact same time, as long as you're not just sitting there forever, then it should be exactly the same every time that you get there. I barely put 2 tires on the first part of that curb there. You can go all the way up on that curb. As long as you have 2 tires still touching the flat ground, you're going to be totally fine. So you should be able to apex a lot earlier and get on the throttle a lot earlier than I did too. Dirt and snow rally tracks are pretty controversial topics when it comes to Gran Turismo 7, but personally, they're actually my favorite. I know it's a lot different than normal circuit driving, but all the rules, all the principles, all the basics, they still apply. You're just applying them on the other side of grip. Let's get into it. This is going to be a tough one, but there is a lot of margin for error. So for the first corner, and truthfully for a lot of corners when it comes to rally, you're going to want to figure out how to do a Scandinavian flick. And that's a bit of a more advanced technique, but I did cover it more in depth in another guide, so I'm going to link it above to the right. If you're back from watching that, or if you just know how to do it, at this red sign right here, We're going to swing it to the left, and then you want to swing it to the right at the yellow barrel. That might be enough for you to figure out how to do this, but if not, please click my link where I go in way more depth in the other guide that I made. The idea here is to accelerate while sliding sideways into this really banked section of the track, obviously staying away from the wall, but you can carry a lot of momentum and a lot of speed into this and stay full throttle while riding up on the bank, and then you can just kind of swing directly out of it. There are lots of different angles you can hit. You can see in that previous ghost that I have that I hit pretty deep. Actually, I don't even know if that's me. That might have been someone else's ghost I was following, but you can see I carried a lot of speed this time. Or at least you'll be able to see after I unpause here. But once again, you're going to look at these yellow barrels, and we're going to swing into the next corner super early right at those yellow barrels, and watch the throttle. We're going to stay on full throttle here. I think I mentioned this in all of the rally guides I've done so far, but you essentially want to point your nose towards the apex long before you actually get there, as you can see what I'm doing right here. Before you get to this green baller that you can see right ahead, we're going to switch directions, add just a little bit of brake to get the car to rotate faster and also bleed off just a little bit of speed, but when we get facing the next apex, we're going to get on the throttle really early, and we should only be able to see that wall if you're using this view. The idea here is to turn yourself so you're facing the exit super early, so you stay on the throttle and your slide momentum blends in with your forward momentum. There's some high camber on this next kink, so make sure you turn in really early to make sure that you don't go super wide around this little kink. If you haven't guessed by now, you really need to rotate your entire car around these corners and do it super early. To keep up your momentum, you should be tracking out towards this structure here on the left, and right before we get there, I like to gently steer towards the next corner without trying to slide very much. Just around this corner is another yellow barrier on the inside, and I like to start a Scandi flick right before then, so I can then start turning in and rotating the car dramatically before we get to that yellow part of the barrier. After the slide is initiated, look at my throttle and you can see that I'm feathering the throttle just a little bit to get the weight transferring more to the front. Gently braking as we downshift to second gear will cause the car to stop rotating and just slide out pretty neutrally, which is exactly what we want because we don't want to start turning in fully for the next corner until we get underneath that little walking bridge. One of the hardest parts about doing rally, especially on a game like this, is determining how much speed you need to go into any corner, and that just comes from practice and experience. So just stick with this. It's going to take a long time before you're really comfortable with it if you haven't done a lot of this before. In second gear, I can get pretty heavily on the throttle. What you can't see, unfortunately, is exactly how much I'm steering. This game doesn't actually show every bit of the steering angle. I think it shows maybe only 70% because I'm not steering fully right here, though it shows that that little red dot is all the way to the right. I'm adding steering as I get on the throttle. And in second gear, when I'm full throttle and already rotating, it's going to make the car continue rotating on a small enough arc that I'm not going to go super wide and hit the far wall. As I negotiate the corner, you're going to see I'm staying on full throttle, but then I come off a little bit, which will transfer more weight to the front, and then I add a little bit of brakes. And if you do that with a combination of steering, you can get the car to continue rotating rather than understeer like we did on the previous portion of the corner. Aiming for about the middle of the track, when you see that blue line right before the green baller, that is when we want to change direction. Second gear is short enough that you actually want to stay on full throttle and swing it to the left before lifting the throttle at all. And then of course you can add a little bit of brakes to keep it tight around this corner and then try to exit really tight on the next corner too. You can see I did shift up to third gear, so we don't have to worry about a shift as we're accelerating out. When we're still kind of negotiating the corner, if we blend the shift with the cornering, then we're not going to lose a lot of momentum as we come out of the corner and have to shift on the straight. Coming up is the toughest corner on the track for me personally. It's the corner where you had to negotiate it with the blue Ford Focus, but yeah, you're gonna see I messed this up too, but I'll teach you how not to do that. So starting at the bullet billboards on the left, we're gonna swing the car in and we're gonna try to carry a lot of speed, but you do not wanna be super sideways. We're gonna be doing a mild slide that's gonna tighten up as we go. Initially staying pretty tight on the inside, we're going to look for the end of the bullet billboards, and that is when we want to tighten it up. As you can see, I'm already in second gear, and that was a huge mistake. Here we actually just want to be in third gear, and in third gear you can stay on the throttle pretty heavily and then add more steering angle and add a little bit of brake and more throttle after that to negotiate the corner perfectly, but I slowed the car way down. I tried to get to third gear to fix it, but I lost all of my momentum, so I was going to go directly into the wall. So I had to counter steer and then start the slide one more time, which of course cost me a lot of time. And then I had a really narrow exit as well with no momentum. And as you can see, that one really fast ghost completely overtook me here. Since I was already apexing, I had to turn in once again, so I made this like a 4-stage corner when in reality it should have been like a 2-stage corner. And as you can see, that ghost had already just taken off, and that's where I lost all my time. For this little kink, there is a lot of that weird camber, that little hill, so you've got to turn in really early so you can slide down towards the outside of the track right here. If you did that last corner correctly, you're going to be able to use this billboard right here, but since I was going a little bit slower than I should, I had to go a little bit beyond that, which is why you're going to see me braking afterwards. After you swing it in towards the corner, you want to brake really hard, downshift all the way to second gear, get back on the throttle once your nose is pointing at the inside of the corner, and then mid-corner, we're actually going to shift up to third gear. This is a wider S than the previous one. Continue to modulate the throttle, don't just stay full throttle, you want to make sure the car is still rotating, and that's going to require you to come off the throttle a little bit. What we're going to try to do is brake, turn the car, and then get back into second gear and flooring it by the time you get to this yellow barrier. Modulating the throttle in second gear and not staying fully on the throttle after the initial slide is going to allow you to stay really close. If you stay fully on the throttle, you're going to swing out too wide. But by coming off the throttle a little bit, you can get the tires to grip up just a little bit, but still slide. And then when your car's facing straight, you can go full throttle, shift up to third gear, avoid that wall, and you're home free. Like I said before, this is all about experience, so spend some time on this. Don't worry about how hard it is. Eventually you'll get the hang of it and you can have some fun with it. So if you're not already familiar with it, I hope you watched the part of my other guide where I detailed exactly what you can do to learn the Scandinavian flick. You're going to notice it in full speed right here, that it's very useful for negotiating any of these rally corners. And you'll also notice that the transition between one corner to a next pretty much always just resembles the Scandinavian flick. Getting used to the entire concept of rotating your car by transferring the weight is very, very important anytime you're doing anything rally related. So as you can see, the first corner links to the second, which links to the third, and then so on and so forth. It's pretty much all one connected slide. Another really important thing to consider is the direction of the weight transfer and the speed of the weight transfer alongside the speed of your car. You'll notice that like doing some things going into this corner that would cause the car to oversteer can cause it to understeer in certain situations. So when we got on the throttle after braking, it caused the car to understeer to extend the entry. But then of course, when we get on the throttle on the exit, it causes it to oversteer. So knowing the relationship between not only what each pedal is going to do, but also how it relates to what the car is already doing is very important. Like I mentioned in this, I downshifted to second, which slowed me down too much, way too early, and then I apexed too early on the exit. I don't necessarily think you should avoid second gear, but if you do use second gear, it's got to be a lot later than I did. If you find yourself hitting the outside walls while sliding, you're probably just not rotating your car enough towards the inside for any of the given corners that's happening on. Obviously, you don't want to be too far away from the inside of the corner in pretty much any circumstance, but there's always an exception to the rule, and as you can see, even though the ghost behind me had passed me in the middle of the corner, because I set it up that way, I got way ahead of it, and I even got closer to the other ghost that I'm chasing. So yeah, get used to sliding. It's going to help you in any of these rally challenges. The good news is, if you've gotten gold on all of them so far, you are halfway done with the Master Super License test. In my opinion, most people have trouble with these snow and dirt rallies compared to the rest of these, so honestly, it's really all downhill from here. The car using this test is really nice and stable, and there's some really funny things you can do with the track limit, so it really shouldn't be too hard to get gold in this one. As it starts, make sure that you track yourself to the left right at the very beginning, and then lift off gently so you can get fully on the throttle and you don't have to worry about lifting off or steering too much to stay on the track. Keep your eyes on the blue Michelin signs. It's the final one we want to pay attention to, and right at that sign, potentially even right afterwards, is when you want to brake. Downshift to fourth, brake in a straight line, and then turn in after the grass ends there on the left. As you can see from my previous ghost, I braked a little bit later, but that caused me to wait too long to get back on the throttle. I think the best way to do it would be somewhere in between what I'm doing now and what I did in the ghost. Stay full throttle from here on out, and don't worry too much about getting all the way to the right of the track. It's more important to keep up your speed. The second to last blue Michelin sign on the left is where you're going to turn in. Keeping your eyes on the left, we're going to look for this set of billboards here that appear right now. Right about then is when you want to come off the throttle. As soon as you get on the curb, you want to get on the brakes, but there's going to be a period of time where you're doing nothing but coasting leading up to that braking point. Putting your left tires on that curb and using it as a guide for where you should go. Once you get to this white line, we're going to brake in a straight line and turn in at the end of that curbing there on the left. Downshift to second for rotation, back up to third when you get on the throttle, and be very gentle. The car is going to be coming off that curb and it's going to be a little unstable. On top of the turning, you can make yourself oversteer and you do not want that. As you navigate this left-hander, lift off slightly to stay on the curb, upshift to fourth, and then continue steering to the left. Aiming for this curb that starts on the left, we want to start turning in before we get to it and then gently lift off the throttle. You'll see that I got a little bit of oversteer and I had to correct that. You've got to be real gentle as you come off the throttle or else you're going to slide. You should be able to stay full throttle from here on out until the next braking point, which is after the curb you're on right now. Angle yourself so only your left tires are going to be on the curb and your right tires are in the grass. That is deliberate because the left tires being on the curb and the right on the grass will help the car rotate into the next corner without having to add too much steering. Continuing to trail brake over this curb will keep the car steady and then gently get back on the throttle. If you keep your left tires just on the part of the curbing that's closest to the track and get all the way back on the track before the white line, you'll be solid and don't have to worry about a penalty. Making sure you gently steer off that curb, move yourself to the left side of the track, look for this billboard, and after the billboard you'll see this break in the wall right here. That is where you want to hit the brakes. You may notice that I was hesitant on the brakes a little bit. I didn't get to 100% brake pressure, and subsequently I also missed the apex, so I think it is a really good starting point. Turn at that final blue Michelin side that was on the left, and of course you want to actually hit this apex. You can go up on that curb and you'll get a lot better exit here, but it is more important to carry speed through there rather than getting on the throttle early. Since it's daytime, we can see the cracks in the pavement very clearly. You'll notice a small crack right here, followed by a longer crack right here, and at that first one is where you want to hit the brakes up on the curb. The dark tire marks on the track give you a really good indication of when you should turn it in, and if you do hit this inside curb, it can upset the car. I like to just completely avoid it, get on the throttle in third, and of course if you get any oversteer, make sure you correct it as soon as you possibly can, because you want to make sure you get enough momentum and a really early start to getting on the throttle for this long straight. If you're like me and you get bored in the straights and you start looking at the different views that you have, such as this beautiful third-person view, make sure you go back to the view that you actually use long before the braking zone, because I've messed up many laps by not doing so. As is the case with many street-legal supercars, you have to brake incredibly early because they go real fast but don't stop real fast, so at the red motul sign, that is when you want to hit the brakes. Brake in a straight line all the way down to third gear and start turning in at the beginning of the curbing here on the right. You're going to continue trail braking and then tighten up the corner by dipping to second gear, and then of course back up to third gear before getting on the throttle. Cutting the first corner is really important to set yourself up so you don't have to steer too much and you don't have to wait too long to get on the throttle for the next right-hander. Just being in the middle of the track should be just fine, but don't cut here or else it'll make your car bump. Be very gentle about getting on the throttle because you can still get oversteer. Aim for the yellow, red, and white part of the bridge right here, because if you go too far to the left, you'll actually drive entirely off the track. It's kind of hard not being able to see where you go, but you'll get used to it after doing it enough. Get yourself all the way to the outside and make sure you lift as you turn off, get back on the throttle, and don't forget to upshift to fifth gear or else you're going to hit that rev limiter and that's going to ruin your lap. Even with that super imperfect lap, we still cleared it by 2.5 seconds, so you should have no problem nailing gold here. So like I just mentioned a few minutes ago, since this is essentially a homologation vehicle, it's a street legal race car. It's just like a modern day hypercar. It's incredibly fast in a straight line, it handles well, but it also does not seem to brake nearly as well as it should, and that's just because it has a lot of power and street legal tires. So give yourself lots of braking room, essentially. Like I mentioned in the breakdown, it's really important that you don't go all the way to the right and sacrifice your speed. If you can get yourself to the right before that left-hander without sacrificing speed, that will be better, but if you have to lift, it's really just not worth it. Lifting on that previous left-hander is worth it, however, so you can stay full throttle as long as possible during this longish S section, and then of course use every inch of the track limits here. You've got a lot more leeway than it initially looks, so use every inch that you got. I think I already mentioned that I didn't go full braking here, and I actually still missed the apex. I should have just gone full braking. I think it is the best place to brake, right in the break of the wall, but you can adjust, obviously. Your speed is going to be really what determines exactly when you need to brake, and of course how you took that last corner will determine all of that. So just make sure that you have a good reference, because you may need to adjust it a little bit before or a little bit after that point when you're actually doing your own lap. There will probably be less variation for this one though, so make sure you brake at that red motul sign. You can also turn in a bit earlier and cut this first left-hander even more, but it is a little bit more dangerous because you can get the car unsettled by going further off and hitting the track, making the car bounce a little bit, but it's still possible. And again, make sure you lift and then upshift to fifth so you don't hit the rev limiter before the end of the lap. The next test is one of the most beautiful cars ever made, in my humble opinion, at one of my favorite tracks, Watkins Glen, and really this one is just a pleasure to do. I absolutely loved doing this test. If you're used to driving Group 3 or Group 4 cars here, you're going to have to relearn how to take it because some parts that usually are full throttle are definitely not full throttle with this car. Keep your eyes out really early for the number signs on the left because the very first one is the one you want to use for a brake marker. The 400-foot sign is when you want to start braking. This car is 1,000 years old, so it's going to take a long time to slow down. Brake in a straight line all the way down to first gear and look for the colored Gran Turismo signs on the left. You're going to turn in right before the final one. Coming off the brakes is going to be really important because you're going to need the car to rotate as you coast in, get back up to second gear, and gently get back on that throttle. You're going to notice I'm not in full throttle for a long time until I get the car really settled and pointing the direction I want to go. Using the entirety of the red and orange part of the curbing, you want to turn off before it ends, and of course you're going to be lifting a lot for this section. Notice how little throttle I'm using as I'm trying to steer the car all the way up onto the inside curb. You'll probably notice that as I go full throttle, the car understeers even at 117 miles per hour. We're going to have to lift off as we steer ourselves onto the other curb again, and then be very gentle about the throttle once again. Once you get aligned with this final part of the curbing, you can get on full throttle and stay there until the next braking point. Once again, you've got to keep your eyes on the number boards really early. You're going to see the 600 and immediately after at the 500-foot board. Right as you pass that, that is when you want to hit the brakes. Start turning in between the 400 and the 300-foot boards, and you're going to aim to get as close to this inside barrier as you possibly can, continuing to decelerate. As I go over the curb, you'll notice that I'm almost entirely off the brakes. I want to wait until my front tires hit the pavement again before adding a little bit of brakes, changing direction, and then immediately coming off the brakes as soon as the car rotates and adding throttle to get the car balanced out. Not too much throttle because you don't want to oversteer and you also don't want to understeer. Just enough throttle to make sure that you hit this next inside curb and then go straight over the exit curbing. As you go over this curb, you have to immediately start trying to prepare yourself for the next corner. Coming off the throttle as we go over it right here will get the car starting to rotate the correct direction. Adding a little bit of throttle, then a little bit more brakes, a little bit more throttle one more time. We're keeping the momentum up and we're also allowing the car to turn in by slowing it down. What you really want to do is make sure you just don't go off the line, but keep as much momentum as you possibly can through the corner. Using the dark tire marks is a really good way to know exactly what line you should take. As I was trying to follow that, you'll see that I have a lot of steering and no inputs, and that's because the car started understeering. In order to fix understeering in a really long corner like this, you can blip the throttle. So you're going to see me blip the throttle, the car's going to start rotating a little bit too much, so I countersteer, but then immediately get back on that throttle so I can track out properly. Right here's when you're going to see me use a lot of throttle really quickly and then immediately countersteer. That got the car to go the right direction and it cured the understeer, so now I can steer like normal while on the throttle. I was a little bit too early though, and I did have a little bit more oversteer, so I had to lift and correct again, but we kept up our momentum. For most race cars, we could use the number signs in the distance as a good braking reference, but this car has such old brakes that we actually have to use the Coca-Cola sign right here to know when we need to hit the brakes. Turn in at the 200-foot board, you're probably going to notice that the car isn't going to respond initially. You just need to keep scrubbing off speed and then downshift to first and start trail braking to get it to really turn in towards the inside curb. Back up to second for the exit. You'll notice I missed the apex entirely, so of course you can do that a lot better than I did. Be very gentle on the throttle. You can initially get understeer or oversteer. Either one is going to be very bad, especially with this slippery outside curb right here. From here, you want to immediately get to the left side of the track because this 300-foot board right here is your next braking point. Start turning in at the 200-foot board and continue trying to find the grip. You're going to have to steer in, come off the brakes, and just constantly search for the grip. You want to stay in second gear for this. No need to go into first gear. And when you do get on that throttle, be very careful if you have too much steering because it will send you into a slide. And going up this hill, it's going to be really bad if you don't fix that immediately. A big slide here will cost you so much momentum that it could completely ruin your lap if you allow yourself to slide there. Going up this hill, keep your eye out for the little number boards that are sitting on the barrier. They're kind of small. When you see this 300, you want to measure about halfway between the 300 and the 200-foot board, and that is when you're going to hit the brakes. You're probably used to this by now, but you've got to brake in a straight line for a long time, and it's not to the 100-foot board that we're going to start turning in. After you start turning in, that's when you want to dip down to first gear, get yourself as close to this curb as you possibly can, and then back on the throttle in second gear. As you can see, I completely missed the curb. You can start turning in a little bit earlier, but I think I just needed to do a better job braking instead. And of course, be gentle on the throttle. Right before this 200-foot board on the right, we're going to hit the brakes, and you're going to wait until the 100-foot board to start turning in. You want to get a late apex for this corner. At this speed on this corner, the car is going to have a very heavy tendency to slide, so be very careful as you get on the throttle and be very ready to counter steer if you need to. You're probably going to need to unless you're incredibly smooth on the throttle here. The earlier the better when it comes to counter steering, so as soon as you feel that your car is sliding out whatsoever, fix it immediately. You do not want to touch the grass on this exit. Looking for the footboards again on the right, you want to brake at the 200. I actually waited too long to brake. I think I had the right brake pressure, but I waited too long and I also turned in too late. You want to make sure that you brake right at the 200 and immediately start turning in while trail braking. Since I missed the apex, it took me a long time to get on the throttle, but as soon as you get yourself to the apex, you should be able to get on the throttle. Of course, gently again, you'll notice that I did get a little bit of oversteer here once I did get on the throttle. If you do get oversteer, make sure you fix that before you start turning over to the left side of the track, or you'll just completely drift over to the left side of the track. If you see where the end of the soft part of this barrier is, you want to hit the brakes a little bit before that and immediately get down to first gear. Turn in at the beginning of the yellow pit entrance line, get up to second gear, and of course, final corner, be very careful you don't slide out here. Gently on the throttle, gradually on the throttle, and of course use the entirety of the track width. I've ruined many laps on this track by going too wide and hitting that wall. Do not make the same mistake that I did. If you developed any drifting skills from that rally test before, they'll probably come in handy for this one. As you watch this in full speed, there's something I want you to really pay attention to. You're going to start noticing on a lot of the corners that I start turning in, but I don't have one crisp steering motion. That's definitely a skill issue, but sometimes with cars like this, you have to really fight to try to find the grip. In this car, when I start turning in and the car doesn't start responding, I know that I've got to do something different, whether that's unwinding the steering wheel, lifting off the throttle, adding the brakes, lifting off the brakes, or a combination of that. I'll point it out again when we get there. For this part, for the high-speed S's, it's really important to make sure you're lifting off as you're turning in because most of the race cars that we drive, that's a full throttle section, but in this ancient car, it is definitely not full throttle. This car is going to want to slide out if you do anything wild, so be very gentle on all of your inputs and try to get the car to rotate. That is really the name of the game. Speaking of, that is why I'm steering, hitting the throttle, hitting the brakes, flipping the throttle to get it to rotate even more, and of course, why I'm steering and then unsteering a lot. This is the main corner I want you to pay attention to. As I'm turning in, you'll notice that I'm really trying to find the grip with the front tires. Watch it back again if you have to, but you'll notice that I steer in and then I unwind the steering wheel probably 5 or 6 times just in that one corner because you really have to search for the grip for this car. If you watched test 5 of this guide, then you probably heard me talk about how the car is going to react different to inputs depending on where the weight is going, and that is true for cars like this too. Older cars that don't have a lot of downforce or don't have a lot of mechanical grip will react a lot the same as the rally cars. I think that was a weird sentence, but I think you get what I'm talking about. When you hit the brakes initially versus hitting the brakes when you're already in the middle of a corner, the car is going to react differently. So just understanding car control and exactly what the car is going to do in different circumstances is key to mastering a track like this or a track and car combination like this. Most modern cars with modern aerodynamics kind of eliminate the need for a lot of that. But if you enjoy driving cars that don't have a lot of aerodynamics, more slippery cars, then you're really going to have to understand exactly how to control a car when it's sliding out. Our next track is an absolute classic, Spa. The car is the CLK LM, and it looks like the car, but it is not actually the car that Mark Webber famously flipped. If you've done any Group 2 racing in sport mode lately, you've probably used this car. It's usually the meta car by a huge margin. It's actually a lot of fun to drive, and it's surprisingly forgiving, so this test probably won't be too hard for you. As a note, I did use +3 on the brake balance for this test, so I do suggest it. As you start off, move to the left immediately and keep your eyes out for the number boards. Your first braking point will be directly at the 100-meter board. I want you to brake in a straight line and be sure not to turn in until after the 50-meter board. Initially turning in second gear, I want you to dip down to first gear temporarily, then back up to second gear, trying to get on the throttle as early as you can, obviously. But of course, don't track out too far. If you go too far on this curb, it can be really slippery. I found a little bit of oversteer is better than hesitating too long on the throttle there. The next 2 corners, Radeon and Eau Rouge, are flat out. Turn in at this digital flag sign you see here on the left, staying full throttle, don't lift whatsoever, and try to get yourself right about here. Follow the tire marks as you steer into the next corner and try to avoid going over the high part of this curb. Until you memorize exactly how much it curves, just wait until you see the curb and try to use as much of it as you can. As you can see, you only need your right tires on the colored part of the curb. The same goes for the exit, and try to do as little steering here as you possibly can. You don't need to go wide for this next kink either. Just let your car gently track out to the left side of the track and stay full throttle. You'll be going very fast, so you may need to brake earlier than you anticipate. Right before the 100 meter board, brake in a straight line up onto the curb. When you pass the red mark on the barrier to the right, that's when you want to start turning in, getting yourself all the way down to second gear before you apex. Gently add throttle and continue steering to the right to set yourself up for this left-hander. See how far I went to the right before even switching directions? Stay on the throttle as you switch directions, then brake just a little bit to get onto the curb before getting back on the throttle, continuing to steer to the left. Sneak in some full throttle before you get to the end of the red part of the barrier on the right. That is when you want to switch directions and then lift off the throttle just gently up to third gear, add some brakes if you need, and you want to get all the way up on the inside curb and all the way up to the outside of the red and yellow curb here as well. Make your way back on the tarmac and then start looking for this curb. Right before the beginning of the curb, you want to hit the brakes. You can double apex this or just make it a super late apex. Either way, you're going to kind of V it up. Get all the way down to first gear, decelerate, and then back up to second gear for the exit, trying to hit the apex right after that green bollard. Gentle throttle is necessary here so you don't slide the car at all. That'll completely ruin your lap. Continue steering to the right until you get to this part where there's a break in the fence. At that point, you should be in third gear and you should be coming off the throttle, on the brakes just a little bit, down to second to rotate, back up to third. Just kiss those bollards and then get back on that throttle heavily. You can use all of the exit on the red and yellow part of the track, but you got to make sure that you get all the way back on the tarmac before the grass. Staying on the right side of the track, keep your eyes out for the number boards like always, and when you get past this 50 meter board, you're going to hit the brakes heavily. At the digital flag display here, you're going to downshift to third and start trail braking and turning in. You may need to come entirely off the brakes as you trail brake in to make sure you hit this apex, but shift up to fourth gear before you get on the throttle and continue steering as you're throttling out of this corner. If done perfectly, you'd probably apex just a little bit earlier, track all the way out, and then hit the second apex right about here before tracking out for the end of the corner. From here, you can actually aim yourself directly to the next part of the curbing, and right before you go underneath this sign, you're going to hit the brakes heavily. Brake in a straight line until right before you get to this white line that you see going across the track, downshift to third, and then further down to second gear, but back up to third, trying to just barely miss this second bollard. Continue riding the curb, continuing to steer right until you get to the sand that you see right here. Then it's full throttle, switch directions, then downshift to second, a little bit of brakes, again trying to just barely miss the last bollard, and then back up to third and back on the throttle. This exit curb can be really slippery, so make sure you're not steering too much by the time you go onto it. This final yellow part of the barrier on the left before the curbing is a really good place to hit the brakes. The next yellow part of the barrier is a good place to turn in. You want to be in second gear just briefly, up to third gear before you get on the throttle, and you want to apex just after the green part. You can technically use all of the red and yellow, but I like to keep 2 tires on the tarmac. Once again, the tire marks are a really good place to learn when to turn in. Stay full throttle initially, but then lift afterwards so you just barely kiss the inside curbing, shifting up to fourth before getting back on the throttle. Use the exit curbing at your own risk. If you go even an inch too far into it, it's going to pull your car all the way off the track. On this full throttle section, we want to steer as little as possible, and when you track out, use as much of the outside of the track as you can. You can see that barely 2 of my tires are within the white lines. You can also use the tire marks that were on the track in the previous part to know when to turn in, but it should be pretty intuitive. You can pretty much just drive straight to the next braking zone, which is right after the 150 meter mark. When your entire car is past it, that's when you hit the brakes. Brake in a straight line until you get to the 50 meter mark, then start turning in, downshifting all the way to first gear. You can actually use a lot more of the curb than I did right there. You want to continue steering to the right and continue driving to the right to give yourself enough space to make sure you don't have to slow down too much for the exit here on the left. Your goal is to hit just the other side of this curb, back up to second gear, and then back on the throttle. Be very careful, and if you get any oversteer, make sure that you correct it as quickly as you can because you can lose a lot of time from sliding out right there. So you'll see that I beat it by over 3 seconds, and with that I'm actually going to point out some of the bigger errors I made so you can avoid them, and you should be able to very easily clear this and get the gold. Firstly, I turned in just a little bit too late here, and I also came off the brakes a little bit too abruptly. I should have really hit that apex. That would have allowed me to get on the throttle a lot smoother, a lot cleaner, and a lot earlier. These corners are super famous. One big mistake that I see a lot of people make is they turn in too early for the right-hander. So make sure you set yourself all the way super wide, turn in late, but then do as little steering after that as you can possibly manage. Like I said in the breakdown, that little kink does not require you to move out to the left to make sure that you can hit it right. You can keep full speed just by staying really close to it. For this corner right here, I think I could have probably carried a little bit more speed through the entirety of this, and then that would have allowed me to get on the throttle a little bit earlier there, but it wasn't that bad. Right here, I think I braked too late. I braked too late, didn't hit that first apex. I think if I did this as a double apex instead of one super late apex, it would have been faster, but I'm not quite sure. On this one, I think I did pretty well. I don't think I lost a lot of time going all the way out on the curbing. It is important to actually use as much of the curbing as you can. And on this one, I apexed too late on the first apex, which meant that I missed the outside part and completely missed the second apex there. I think you can do that part a lot faster. I think if you turn in a little bit earlier on this right-hander, you can actually keep up more speed. You might not even need the second gear at all, but it does, of course, help. You can get off the brakes a lot more if you use the downshifting, if you use the compression braking, so I do use that trick a lot in this lap. You can go even further out on this curb, which means that you can get on the throttle earlier and turn in earlier for this one, which also means that you can get on the throttle earlier for that exit, but it's also very scary and it's really easy to slide out, so do that at your own risk. I think I did this part pretty efficiently, but setting up for the last braking zone, I should have moved over to the left earlier so I could brake in a straight line, and I would have been able to brake a little bit later, I think. I also turned in too late there, and I didn't come off the brakes early enough on the right-hander, which meant that I didn't use nearly enough of the curbing for that right-hander. You can cut it a lot more than I did. All in all, over 3 seconds better than gold, so clearly it wasn't too bad. The penultimate test is at the Red Bull Ring. It looks like a pretty simple track, but it is incredibly deceptively complicated, and the car we're using is very difficult to control, but because of that, the margins are not that small. If you're used to driving this track with Group 3 or Group 4, be warned, your braking points are going to be much earlier. Move up onto the curb like you usually do, but between the 150 board and the beginning of the green, right in the middle is where you're going to hit the brakes. Making sure you use all of the curb, brake in a straight line, get all the way down to second gear, and right before the 50-meter board, you're going to turn in, upshift to third, and go over that little yellow sausage curb. I hate that thing. Stay well clear of the sausage curb on the exit, and then when you get up to fourth gear, that's when it's usually safe to start using the overtake button. As I was recording this, I completely forgot how much the ghosts can obscure your braking points, so I apologize for that, but you should still be able to see it. Right after where the curb starts, at the green AstroTurf, that is when you want to hit the brakes. Braking in a straight line, I try to mainly avoid the curb here, and what we're going to look for is this kind of break in the coloring of the tarmac. That is when we're going to turn in and we're going to be in first gear. Apex late, avoiding the high part of the curb. I actually completely missed the curb here, unfortunately, but skip second gear, all the way up to third gear, and be very gentle on the throttle. Make sure you track out using all of the track. I actually turned too much, and I didn't use as much track as I could. I think I was afraid of the curb, but either way, you can use a lot more than that. Once again, you've got to make sure you use all of that overtake as soon as you can, which is usually right about at fourth gear. Approximately halfway between the end of the grass and the beginning of the 150-meter board is where you're going to hit the brakes here. Once again, braking in a straight line, we're going to get all the way down to second gear, and after the 50-meter board is when we're going to turn in, trying to apex really late on this one. Back up to third gear for acceleration. You probably could use fourth gear, but I used third just to be safe, because when you're in a higher gear and you do slide, it becomes a lot more difficult to catch than when you're in a lower gear. You can see I also didn't track out as much as I should have. That would also save you from too much oversteer. Right at the 100-meter board here is when we're going to brake, and we're going to aim for the 50-meter board in the distance. Braking straight onto the curb just past the 15-meter board, you can follow the tire marks that come off the curb as a good point to turn in. Tip to second for rotation, aiming for a really late apex here. I use a little bit of throttle in third. I probably should have just skipped straight to fourth, and that would have probably helped me get on the throttle a lot smoother, but yeah, you could probably use fourth there instead of third at all. Going all the way up on the curb is just fine, but you've got to make sure that your left tires don't go over the line beyond that. Right at the last red part of the curb is when you want to hit the brakes. Turn in third gear before the road on the right converges, just following the tire marks on the ground, and we want to hit the apex right in the middle here, so we can get a pretty much straight shot going over the exit curb and then using all of the exit curb on this right-hander as well. It's wild that full throttle here can make you go all the way off track, so you've got to be really careful with it, but when you are confident in your full throttle, make sure you use that overtake once again. For the next braking zone, aim so you know that you're going to go all the way up onto the curb. When your entire car passes the grass, that is when you want to hit the brakes. You want to turn in before the 50-meter board. You'll see that I turned in right about the 50-meter board, and I actually missed the apex by a little bit. Not missing that apex will allow you to go a lot faster, obviously, but you'll save yourself a massive amount of time and be able to get on the throttle more gentle than that, not sliding, and earlier. On the right side of the track, you'll see that it's painted red, white, red. After the white portion is when you're going to hit the brakes. Making sure you're using as much of the curb as you can, you want to start turning in at the beginning of the grass. I dipped to second and then went back up to fourth. I could have turned in a little bit earlier than that though and gone over the yellow sausage curb. That doesn't really disturb the car too much and you will be able to get on the throttle a little bit earlier than I did. Really not a great lap at all, but you'll see that the margin is so huge that it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Like I just mentioned, I'm not actually very proud of this lap, but I also really did not enjoy doing this time attack. And once I saw how much of a margin I had to finishing it with gold, I figured that it was definitely good enough. And I should mention a lot of the mistakes I made here so that you can definitely squeeze the most out of it. I think potentially I could have kept more speed up going into T1 and I would have been able to get on the throttle a little bit earlier there. You'll notice here that I completely miss the inside apex, as well as not really use all of the exit. I think I was really afraid of slipping on the outside curbing, but I don't think you really need to be afraid of it, you just need to be careful. I think I could actually brake later, turn in earlier, and carry more speed through here. I did hit the apex, but I didn't really go up on the curb, and when I exited, I didn't go near the track out. I didn't go near the exit curbing, so I think there's a lot of time to be made up there as well. I didn't make proper use of the curbing here. You could go all the way out, just putting your left tires on that curbing on the entrance. And then if we use more of the curbing, both on the apex and the exit of that last corner, it would have been better. Same with this sequence of turns. And if you do use the curb a little bit more, then you'll be able to get it on the throttle earlier. And of course, that just translates to a faster line. I missed the apex here and I slid out, so obviously we didn't do very good there. So obviously if you clean that up, you'll go a lot faster than I did. And finally, on the final corner, you can actually go straight over that yellow sausage curb. So clearly, you can do a lot better than that. Jumping immediately to the final test, not only of the Master Super licenses, but all of the Master licenses in general, is one of the most dominant F1 cars and one of the most legendary cars that we've ever seen. Driven by Prost and Senna, if you are familiar with this car at all, then you know how much of a pleasure it is to be able to drive it in this game, and it is absolutely one of my favorite cars in the whole game. It can also be pretty tricky, especially at Suzuka, but I've got some tips for you. It's not quite as important to carry a ton of speed through this whole Casio triangle at the very beginning when you first start your attempt, but make sure you're in third gear as you exit and you get on the throttle as early as you possibly can. But here's the big tip with this: double shift up. Either 3 to 5 or 4 to 6. Double shifting saves you a whole bunch of time, and it is absolutely the secret to getting a really good time here. For turn 1, we're actually going to start turning in right before the 50-meter board, and after you've started aiming at the first curb, that's when you're going to downshift to 5th and hit the brakes before you get to that curb. We want to continue downshifting at a rhythm, but if you need some exact references, I like to get to 4th before the end of this curb here on the right, 3rd before the beginning of the curb on the left, and 2nd before turning in, which is going to be before the end of the curb on the left. You should be slowly decreasing the brake pressure, trail braking through this entire section, and when you get to the beginning of this final curb on the right, you should be completely off of the brakes for just a brief moment. Get back up to 3rd to throttle out and be very gentle and very careful. You do not want to slide out here. Use all of the track on exit and immediately make your way to the right. After you gradually get yourself to the right, you should be fully turning in by the end of the colored part of the barrier here on the right. I like to downshift to 3rd here. I don't use the brakes, I just feather the throttle to make sure that I can aim the car all the way up onto the curb here. Continue turning to the left until you see the beginning of this dark part of the tire marks here. That's when you're going to change directions, brake just briefly, and then get back on the throttle trying to ride all the way up on the curb on the right. Trying to stay about middle of the track here, we're going to go full throttle until we're at the end of the curb here on the left, and then we're going to switch directions. Once again, just using a little bit of throttle lift rather than the brake to get all the way up on the curb here. We're going to continue turning left past the apex, of course, and then set up for this right-hander. Change directions, then lift, and add a little bit of brakes, downshifting to 2nd to stay really close to the inside here. Back up to third for the exit. You can see that I actually slipped out just a little bit, so be very careful on the throttle. We want to get all the way to the right where you see the tire mark starting here. Once again, it's a perfect place to change direction. This time we're going to lift off the throttle, then upshift to fourth gear and gently get back on the throttle. We want to be full throttle from here all the way to Degner 1. It shouldn't be a problem as long as you were patient enough to get on the throttle, but of course you want to avoid going off the track there at all costs. Line yourself up on the left, and after the 100 meter board, we see this digital flag marker. We're going to brake as we pass it, and then we're going to turn in right after the 50 meter board. Downshift to third and be as brave on the throttle as you possibly can, passing this first apex. Go all the way up on the curb here. It is incredibly tough to see, but this little black mark on the white line is the only thing that you can really use as a reference, but when you get used to it, you're really going to rely on your instincts rather than specific brake markers. Turn in at the beginning of the grass in second gear, back up to third, use as much of this curb as you can, and then gently get back on the throttle, of course tracking all the way out. You can use all of the curb, but you've got to make sure you steer back onto the tarmac before the grass, of course. Turn into this kink really late so you can align yourself right on the other side when it straightens out, and brake at the end of the curb. Braking in a straight line, aligning yourself with the right side of the track, look for this soft part of the barrier on the right. You should be in first gear and turning in right at the beginning of that part of the barrier. Back up to second for the exit, and of course be very wary of the turbo lag. Be very careful, you can slide out really dramatically here. So be very careful with your steering and don't go full throttle until your car is pointed straight out of there. For this part, I like to go from third to fifth. You can also go from fourth to sixth. Either way, you're going to have to double shift at least once before the next braking zone. In between the 150 meter boards is a little concrete access road, and about 2 car lengths before that is when you want to hit the brakes. Get to third gear and turn in after the 50 meter board, trying to make sure you hit this apex right here. Squeeze as much throttle as you can from that apex to this exit curb, and look for the point right here where the dirt turns into concrete. That's approximately when you're going to hit the brakes again, get down to second gear, and then back up to third gear once you know that you can apex correctly. Get back on the throttle really gently because you know the exit of spoon has weird camber, and of course track all the way out, being very wary of any of that oversteer. Once again here, I shifted from third directly to fifth, and then just of course a single shift up to sixth because there's no seventh gear. And for the final corner, you can stay full throttle. Be careful actually not to steer too much. Align yourself on the left early because the 150 meter board is our braking point. Brake heavily, keep your wheel pointed straight, and get all the way down to second gear. We're going to turn in right after the 50 meter board. Using as much of this curb as you can, sneak in some more throttle and look for where the tarmac changes colors. When you get past that, all the way past it, you're going to switch directions, lift off up to third gear, and then of course use as much of the entry and exit curb as you possibly can. Be very gentle on the throttle. You'll notice that I'm not on full throttle until I'm past the pit entry, and then stay really tight for a really good exit. All right, one final full speed breakdown. So like I said in the previous segment, I don't think I really need to go over the braking point for the entry into this. You just have to make sure you're in third gear, and of course use as much of the curbing for the exit here, both on the entry and the exit of this left-hander, and you should be just fine. The most important thing is to double upshift. I like going from third to fifth and then a single up to sixth. You can also choose to go from fourth to sixth. Either way, double upshift, it is the way. For T1, you got to be really brave. You turn in first, then brake, gradually bleed off speed. I missed the apex here, so obviously there's some more time to be found. And using all of the clues around you is really important. So that barrier changes color to know when to turn in. You want to stay mostly in the middle of the track for these S's. For this final one, be very careful on the throttle so you don't slide out. And then get on the throttle as early as you can for this left-hander. I believe it's Dunlop corner because it is a very high-speed section. The earlier you can get on it, the better, obviously. You can be a bit more brave at the beginning of Degner, but if you go too high on the curb, it will send your car flying. I was pretty unhappy with myself for completely missing this apex. I think you need to turn in just a little bit earlier than I did, but despite the fact that I completely missed it, I still went a lot faster than my previous time, so I decided to keep it, and obviously my time was over 2 seconds better than it needed to be, so clearly it wasn't too bad. I don't think you need to go nearly as wide as I did there. I was afraid of steering too much for some reason. On spoon, you want to be as brave as you can in between the two corners. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, it's really weird and off camber there, so you can get a lot of understeer and understeer turns into oversteer. For this final straight portion, double upshift again, and then stay full throttle here. Don't turn too hard, you'll just scrub your tires and lose speed. but do get a line on the left as early as you can. If I turned in a bit earlier and used more of the curb, I'd be able to get on the throttle more between those two corners and find a little bit of time, but that wasn't too bad. And of course, stay close to the inside to maximize every hundredth that you possibly can. So there you have it. If you manage to get all of the golds, then you will be rewarded with the car that you just used. Obviously, you only have to get all of the golds for this specific set of licenses to earn this, so if somehow you didn't get all the golds from one of the previous tests, you'll still get that ticket and you'll be rewarded by seeing this screen right here. I really hope my guide helped you. If this did indeed help you get the gold, please let me know in the comments below, and also let me know if there are any other guides that you need made. I would be willing to make many more guides for any of the other single player challenges that you might face. Good luck, and no matter where you are in your sim racing journey, this is absolutely doable by anyone who tries it.